Comics are a trap where you get an idea for a story and you want to make a comic, but if you never made a comic before, then you might be overwhelmed at the amount of work it takes and how hard making a comic could be if you're unprepared for the work that it takes. One of the more important parts of making a comic is learning how to properly panel so readers can understand the story and you, the artist, can have a fun time making your comic. So here's the first of a series of videos I want to make where I talk about different aspects of making a webcomic and showcase how other webcomics utilize different parts of webcomic making in their works. A bit of a lesson with the benefit of studying the works of others and showcasing pages that highlight specific topics in a way that's inspirational. I also get to yap about comics I personally really like, so have your pens ready for some reading recommendations. The art that you'll see in this video are going to be various time lapses I've recorded, along with pages of the comics I will be talking about. I'll admit I recorded a lot of time lapses, but I haven't really had much of a use for them recently, and haven't really had the time to record art specifically for this video, cause it's art fight this month and I am suffering. Not from art fight, I just have been working so much. But enough about all of that, let's talk about what a webcomic panel is. Or just a comic panel in general, it doesn't have to be just for webcomics. A comic panel is a small space that shows a scene in a story with multiple panels making up a page. Pages are usually separated, creating a space called a gutter that allows to eye the rest of it before the next panel, but it isn't entirely necessary for a comic page, although it does make for much easier reading. Comic panels can be borderless or lined up with each other. It's all up to how you want your comic to look. Now, there isn't a specific one way to do paneling. Paneling a comic is very dependent on how you want a comic to be read, and can look differently if your story is meant to be printed in a book or if it's only meant to be read on a phone. Deciding how you want your comic to be read can influence how your panels will look, so I do think you should decide that before jumping straight into your story. However, making little comics to experiment with your style can help you learn how you want your new big comic project to be read. For example, let me talk about my Magnus Archives Infinity Train crossover comic, Not Quite Somewhere Else, for a moment. Not Quite Somewhere Else isn't my main focus project, that is what In Harmony, my other webcomic, is, and so I dedicate more time to the latter rather than the former. But Not Quite Somewhere Else has been running longer than In Harmony, and without Not Quite Somewhere Else, I probably would have struggled with how I wanted to do the pages when I finally started In Harmony, because both of them are set up pretty similarly if you compare the pages to each other. Although Not Quite Somewhere Else at this point is hundreds of pages longer than In Harmony is, what I use for Not Quite Somewhere Else, mainly when I work on the comic, is I use to experiment with new comic making techniques. You can just tell by comparing the pages from the very first update to a more recent update, but you can also see my experimentation throughout the story. I would take time to mess with panel sizing and space, having no borders, or even playing around with what the borders of the panels are. One of my favorites was messing with how I wanted to portray memories when the characters would interact with the memory tapes, just as an example. Now, I'm not encouraging everyone to make an over 300-page fan comic to play with before you get to your magnum opus, but making comic pages just to experiment with how you want your comic to look can get you a long way, and I encourage you to play with how you want to do paneling before you decide the exact style of comic you want to make. One of the ways you can figure out how you want the paneling in your webcomic to look is by thumbnailing your pages before actually sketching them. A thumbnail is a little image, not even the size of a small doodle, just a tiny little square that can give you the idea of how you want to lay out a scene, or in this case, a comic page. Here is one from an In Harmony page, and the final page for comparison. Thumbnailing your comics can give you a rough idea about how you want to lay out a comic page, and by having a visual reference you could look at, it will make it easier for your paneling to look the way you want it to. Now, I talked a lot about techniques for practicing paneling, but not a lot about how to panel itself. It again comes down to how you want your comic to be read. If you're making traditional comic pages, it's going to look different than if you're making something meant to be read on webtoons. They all have their pros and cons. Strips like a newspaper strip are easier to do in terms of paneling, but can be limiting due to the amount of space you have. Scroll comics are great on phones that can allow for playing with great reveals, and it's just easier to read on a smaller screen, but again, don't have as much space as a page of a webcomic book-like page. You know what I'm talking about. Trying to surprise the reader with certain reveals can be more difficult on a comic book page, but you have more room to play with in the space. I recommend trying different formats while figuring out how you want to do your comic just before jumping right into it. It'd make it easier for you in the long run, especially if you're somebody who isn't really sure how to make a webcomic in the first place. In my works, because they're supposed to be read like in a comic book, I use the advice from Star Pritchard's book How to Webcomic, and mostly try not to have my panels exceed 3 panels vertically and 4 panels horizontally, while also not having every panel be the exact size and shape. Think of it like a graph, and how much space you can allocate for each panel, and how much each scene needs to properly tell the story. Now, does every page have to have 3 panels across and 4 panels up and down? Not if you don't want them to. In most of the pages of In Harmony, they tend to be 2 panels across and 3 panels up and down, but unless you have a specific way you want a scene to be read, this is a safe rule to follow to make sure your panels, and by extension your comic, remains readable. Regardless of how you want your comic to look, there are many ways to make your panels more interesting. You can overlap panels, change their shapes, and they don't have to be squares. You can use them to highlight a much larger scene in order to influence how a reader may read a page, or use it to highlight a part of a larger image in order to draw the reader's eye to a certain aspect of a scene. It's all about how you want to make it, so if you find paneling to be intimidating, then don't feel stressed out about having to make crazy good panels. You can make really interesting comic pages that have seemingly simple paneling, but it's how you compose those panels together in a shot that can make a page really stand out. What I mean by composing a shot in a panel is figuring out how you want a scene in a panel to look, and working your panels into highlighting specific parts of it. This is what also makes thumbnailing important when making webcomics, because this allows you to see what the general idea of what you're going for will look like, and give you a visual to work off of when making the final page. I'll bring up an example from my webcomic In Harmony, specifically with page 41 of chapter 4. In this scene, Joel and Deb have successfully trapped a monster, whose alias, for the sake of not revealing upcoming spoilers, is Adequacy. At this point, they had tricked Adequacy into falling into a pit with stakes. They had placed gasoline in the pit, and on the previous page, Joel had yelled at Deb to start the fire. So in this page, I really wanted to have that almost slow motion movie feel of an object falling, while the victim of said object's fall watches in horror at what is about to happen to them. In this case, starting a fire. That can be hard to translate in comics, especially if you're not doing a scrolling comic, so I had to think about how I wanted to do it. I tend to thumbnail my comic on a scene-by-scene basis, so I got to sit on the thumbs for this scene for quite a while. In my first pass, I had the frame where Deb opens the lighter, we see her drop it from an angle where we, the audience, are in the pit, and we see multiple images of the lighter falling, but on the bottom we have 2 panels of Adequacy looking up in horror, and another one with the fire catching in the next one. And this was fine. But I saw that when I got to the sketching, I thought I could do better. And this was the final result with the sketch. I made the panel with Deb holding the lighter smaller, had her face and lighter brought closer to the scene, and kept the image of us looking up at her as she dropped the lighter. I wanted to highlight her expression as she started that fire, while also keeping that angle that makes it seem like we also are in the pit. But instead of 2 panels on the bottom that show Adequacy's reaction and the fire starting, I instead had 1 panel of Adequacy's reaction farther up on the page, and then a second panel, this time showing a clearer shot of the gas cans in the pit with Adequacy, and then moved the fire to the bottom of the page, showing that gas plus fire equals Crispy a monster. I wanted it all to be read in tandem together, so as we're watching the lighter fall, we also see the reactions and could put 1 + 1 = 2, all together before we reach the bottom of the page where the fire gets started. And here we are back to the final result, one where we could linger more on that lighter falling due to the extra panels farther up the page before the reaction. I made some adjustments to the shot, but one of the things about this page I like that can make for good comic paneling is flow and movement. I wanted the reader to follow the lighter, slowing its descent as I gave the reader more to look at before it hits the ground. In the end, I think I got what I wanted for this shot, and by compositing the panels to work with the movement of the lighter, it made for a much more interesting final page than what would have been made if I only stuck with my original thumbnail. And never be afraid to make multiple thumbnails. You'll never know what will come out of it. If you're not satisfied with your page and you think you could do better, feel free to just make more thumbnails. Thumbnails are literally the part of the comic making process where you mess around with what you want until you get what you want. The only reason I just jumped straight from thumbnailing to sketching is because I am lazy and I knew what I wanted, and it worked out for me, so there you go. Now I think we covered just about everything I could think of, so let's do the next part of the video and see how other webcomic artists do their webcomics paneling, while also giving me the opportunity to give you guys recommendations for comics I like to read. I'm going to preface this by saying there will be absolutely spoilers for all these webcomics, just to add context to the pages I'll be talking about, so if you plan on reading any of these webcomics and want to go in totally blind when you do read them, then just skip this part of the video, or at the least the parts about the comic you want to read. If not, I'm going to be so delighted to talk about comics I like. I got 4 lock and loaded to talk about, so let's start studying with our first webcomic, Dumbing of Age by David Willis. Dumbing of Age is a linear, slice-of-life webcomic about college. We follow Joyce Brown, a homeschooled Christian girl who is in her first year of college. As she navigates a new world she is not used to, we also learn about the various students from her dorm, from the students to the teachers from her classes. There is a lot about this comic I could talk about. All the characters are very well developed, and Dumbing of Age isn't afraid to talk about subjects from homophobia and transphobia, student protests, racism, and the difficulties of growing up past the biases your parents may have ingrained into you. I enjoyed this webcomic so much. It updates daily and there's so much to read. This backlog is huge. I don't know how David Willis manages to have the same buffer he has, but I salute you, sir. Dumbing of Age, on the website at least, is read like a newspaper comic strip, which means it's usually read from left to right, but normally doesn't have panels that go up or down. It doesn't leave a lot of room in terms of making incredibly chaotic, all over the place, detailed panels, but in a way I think that you can get some incredibly impactful moments just by how you compose a scene that harmonizes with how you panel it. So let me show a few examples with Dumbing of Age. Of all the strips of Dumbing of Age, this one titled Birthday Stuff is the one I think about the most in terms of paneling for impact. The character in this scene's name is Ruth, and in much of the earlier parts of the story, she had a girlfriend named Billy. Both Billy and Ruth are absolute messes, with Billy being a self-destructive alcoholic and Ruth being suicidally depressed. Billy would push Ruth to do her duties as RA, and eventually the both of them seek out help with their initial problems. There's way more to it than that in the story, but you gotta read the comic to find out what happens, because I am not going into it. The context for this scene is this takes place after a time skip, where during it, both Billy and Ruth broke up. Billy seemed to have moved on and is doing well for herself, and Ruth is on medication for her depression, but she still has to go on with emotions of being in a leadership role. I love this strip just because of this last bit at the end, and what I was talking about with having multiple panels used for one image. We have our first panel where Ruth asks about what she should do for someone's birthday, in this instance her own birthday, and the second one highlighting that Billy isn't there. Ruth is just talking to herself, but she wants to talk to Billy. I love this strip because it says so much about Ruth and how much she misses Billy despite being the one who broke up with her, and I think it's just a very, very neat strip. It's one of the ones that I think about the most. You can also do this one specific thing I love that webcomics do sometimes, and how moments layer over each other. One of the ones I like is from the strip called Shocking Reveal, but this scene happens shortly after a character named Amber had an altercation with her abusive father, and she ended up punching him in the face after he insulted her mother. What I like about this strip in particular is how much it gives us about Amber, not just about what she has been through, but also how she sees herself and the things that happened in her life. In this one panel, for example, this was from when she punches her dad, but that was repurposed from this shot, which was repurposed from when the punching her dad part of the scene actually happened. And I think it's just really neat how all these strips work together so well despite not being presented exactly right next to each other. It also just visually gives us so much about Amber, because at this point we haven't learned about what happened to her for Amazing Girl to exist. I just think Amber is a very neat character, and her depiction as someone with DID is very fascinating to me, outside of a two-dimensional horror sense, which is the only way I've ever seen characters with DID presented outside of autobiographical comics. I don't know, I just think she's neat. But now we're going to pivot away from Dumbing of Age, and I want to talk about scroll comics. There are a lot of ways you can take advantage of a screen, whether it be on a phone or a computer, that can make reading comics a bit more advantageous than reading it on a page-by-page or a script-by-script basis, but can easily be messed up if done wrong. Scroll comics can easily be made into scrollable walls of text, just as comic book pages comics could easily be just a bunch of heads talking to each other for different squares. But when you're doing scrolled comics, and if you're taking real advantage of the format, you could go and have some incredibly cool looking scripts. So I want to talk about a really long fan favorite comic of mine called Steven A. Universe, also known as the White Diamond Steven A.U. comic by the Chekhov. Steven A. Universe is set in an alternate version of the events of Steven Universe, where instead of being the son of Rose Quartz, or if you've never seen Steven Universe, here's a major spoiler warning, Pink Diamond, is instead the son of White Diamond. However, unlike most other AUs of this nature I've seen, where instead of being an AU where the White Diamond takes the place of the rebel leader of the Crystal Gems, instead, there's only a slight deviation to the show's canonical timeline that makes it so Greg and Rose never had Steven. In the story, Steven is not Rose's son because she never had a kid, but she still plays a major part in the story regardless. It's such an interesting take on the Steven is a different Diamond AU, and I love that this webcomic does it with its characters to feel just as refreshing as if I am watching Steven Universe for the very first time again. And as you can probably already guess, this comic is a scroll comic. It's technically an Ask blog comic, but the asking features at the current point of the story, to me, tend to set the scene for the current storyline of the comic, rather than a complete direct influence of the character's actions. I enjoy it, and it sets up some really fun ways to answer questions that the commenters leave. One of the ways Steven A. Universe does this well is with the episode titled Before Part 2. In this episode, Steven, Earl, which by the way is the name Pink Pearl goes by in this AU, and Connie are on their way to the moon base. I love this opening monologue about how diagrams depict the Earth and Moon being close, like a textbook image of the two that you would see in like a science class, but then it takes advantage of the scrolling method by making us scroll through to feel how truly far apart the Moon and Earth are together, and it's such a great way to depict distance from each other. It makes their task feel much more daunting and also adds intrigue to the moon base, despite being a place that viewers of the original show should already be familiar with. It does it again a few updates later in the Storm Part 2. In this scene, they're trying to get back to Earth to help save the planet from the cluster, but the ship isn't moving fast enough and Steven is panicking. Lion shows up and Steven takes Lion to go below the Earth to where Rose and Pearl have gone to stop the cluster, and I just love these series of shots that show not only how far they have to travel to reach Rose, but also the reactions of the characters as everything falls apart and the state of the world around them is just devastating. It's so incredibly well done, and the fact that there's no dialogue really just adds on to the urgency of the scene, but how dire everything is, and the scroll format makes it seem like this onslaught of chaotic everything happening is never going to end because there's just too much of it. It's a brilliant way to panel a comic while also taking advantage of the format. It's just an example of how phenomenal a story can be when different aspects of the way you panel every scene works in complete harmony with each other. Now my examples show using squares or diamond-shaped panels for your comics, but one of the ways you can make your panels using other shapes as objects just to make different scenes pop out and your paneling a little more interesting if you are personally not very excited with only using square-shaped objects. I have two examples we're going to look at, but let's start with our first example, which is the webcomic Lunar Blight by Studio Cartridge. Lunar Blight stars John Rayo, a knight of the moonlit sanctuary. When human scientist Guillermo de Leon arrives with news of a vampire uprising, John and his fellow knights set out to protect humanity. But as trouble brews in the sanctuary and his doubts grow, John must decide where his ambitions lie and what will happen if they diverge too far from the goals of the Lunar Guard. Lunar Blight is a gothic horror comic, and of the four I'm talking about for this video, probably the most mature one. It's got body horror and the content of the 18 and up variety, so if that's up your alley, you should go check it out. I think it's a pretty good read. One of the things I love most about Lunar Blight though is its unique set of panels. There's so many pages where these panels are circles and arches, and I cry. I love it so much. It's so good. It's so good. Especially since like the sanctuary is very much like a church with a conclave and a bishop, and they use these like arch-shaped panels. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm reading this comic like it's a church. I just like it. It's so good. There's like, I don't know, it's just like, it gives me that it's kind of like looking through church windows to read a comic. It's very good how well done that they do this like panel setup with it. Like, my favorite page that they have done so far using arches has to be page 35 of chapter 4. The Bishop of the Moonlit Sanctuary, Iarfleith, is going through the sanctuary into the basement, and I love how these panels descend along with him. The panels really take advantage of the space the page allows and makes your eyes descend through the panels like a spiraling staircase almost. And despite the number of panels on this one page, it does not feel like it's too much. There's enough information for the eye to see and understand what is happening, and enough space for the rest. This is also a great example about how you can break simple rules to elevate what's going on a page. Like the rule I said I typically follow with my pages for In Harmony, where I try to keep pages within 3 panels vertically and 4 panels horizontally. Understanding the rules is important when starting out, but I think this page is a very good example where after you learn the rules, you then learn how to break them. They also use these huge circle panels in some of the pages. I really like this page from chapter 4, page 28. This scene follows John and Guillermo after a fall. Guillermo is injured and John is helping him through the woods, and I just really like this foreshadowing of what these woods hide around the circular panel, especially with Guillermo's line about their trek back to the other nights being a walk in the park. I think it works well in this instance, and this isn't the only time that Lunar Blight has these circular panels. Sometimes they even have half circle and almost crescent shaped ones that are very reminiscent of the phases of the moon, and considering that this webcomic is called Lunar Blight, I think it fits the theming of the story very well. And speaking of theming, one of the things I like with webcomic paneling is how you can fit motifs into them. Like with Lunar Blight, with its arch-shaped and circular panels being subtle calls to the fact that the story features characters who are part of a group that worships the moon, panels are also great to explore individual character motifs or emotions just to add on to what is happening in the story. So the final comic whose paneling we're going to talk about today is the webcomic Cast-Off by the Starfish Face. In Cast-Off, we follow Vector, a young boy with glowing yellow eyes that causes fear when people gaze into them. Vector desperately wants friends, so when he meets bounty hunter Ariana, the first person who could look at him and not immediately react in fear, he thinks he may have found one. Then she kidnaps him. The two of them must travel together to return Vector home, along the way meeting new friends and finding even more trouble. Ariana is a bounty hunter, and we see pieces of her past as we go through the story, and although we don't have the full story quite yet, one thing we know is that Ariana Marcel is dead. At least according to Zara. Zara is an elf, and although we don't have the full story yet in the comic, we know that he had left Ariana at a magic academy after the death of her brother. According to Zara, he witnessed Ariana's death, but that moment haunts him throughout the story. But one of the things that I love with Cast-Off in terms of its paneling is how the story ties Zara and Ariana together, despite the two of them reuniting only recently in chapter 13. I know me saying that is probably going to age badly if people are watching this video years later. I don't care, it's staying in the video anyway. Cast-Off has a big broken glass motif. You can see it as early as the prologue, where we see this cold open about two mysterious figures performing unethical magic experiments on a tied up person. But the first time we see this theme with Zara and Ariana is on page 2 of chapter 5, where Zara is having a nightmare about Ariana's death. With Ariana, I had to scroll through the comic, scroll through so many pages just to double check, but I hope I am right. But the first time with Ariana that we see this broken glass theme is in her point, at least in her point of view, is in this moment on page 54 of chapter 10, where Ariana is looking for a missing Vector and Frankie, and is trying and failing to track them with magic. Her spell won't work, and in the moment where she is asking why the spell isn't working, the scene begins to parallel the moment from her past where her and Zara are looking for Ariana's brother Luca with the same spell, and they later find out that he was killed. And the images of this panel match very closely to the images we see on page 2 of chapter 5 when compared to them side by side. I love Cast-Off's use of motif with its paneling, and it doesn't stop at just these flashback moments with Zara's nightmares and Ariana's past, but also used when depicting Ariana's anger and Zara's guilt, and even sometimes with characters' grief that aren't just Ariana and Zara's. I think it adds so much to a story in such a creative way that makes moments in the story stand out so much and only elevates what is already an impactful moment in the story. And that is it for this video. I hope this was both fun and informative and will help you think about creative ways to take your comic paneling to the next level while also giving you some new stuff to read. Again, the comics I talked about were Dumbing of Age by David Willis, Stephen A. Universe by The Chekhov, Lunar Blight by Studio Cartridge, and Cast-Off by The Starfish Face. Links to each webcomic will be in the description of this video. Go give them a read! What webcomics do you read that you think have excellent paneling? Leave them in the comments section down below. If you guys like this video, I may do more in the future. All the aspects of making a comic work together in tandem, and you can learn how you want to make your comic by studying how others do it. I just think analyzing comics techniques is neat. I have ideas for future videos I want to do, so if you want more comic making tips in the future, feel free to subscribe and like the video. I just think analyzing comic techniques is neat. I have ideas for future videos I want to do, so if you want more comic making tips in the future, feel free to subscribe and like the video. Every bit helps to get my work out there. And speaking of, if you like what I make, consider checking out my own webcomic, In Harmony. We are currently on hiatus before chapter 5, but the comic is planned to start back up again on August 30th. Now is the best time to catch up if you haven't already. But if you can't wait for August 30th, patrons get pages 2 weeks ahead of everyone else. Currently, patrons have been fed little things such as doodle pages for my next webcomic project, and the Chapter 4 Monster blog, where I break down my design process for the story's newly introduced monstrosity. If that sounds neat to you, then go check it out. Patrons also get their name on my monthly long-form videos, so if you want your name here too, become a member today! Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye!